Welcome back to our enthralling journey through American Prometheus as we step into Chapter 3. In this installment, the plot thickens and we continue to unravel the gripping story of our American icon. Chapter 2 brought us closer to their remarkable life, but Chapter 3 promises even more surprises, triumphs, and challenges. As we explore the pages of this biography, remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell, ensuring you won't miss a single chapter of this compelling narrative. Without further ado, let's turn another page and venture deeper into the world of American Prometheus.
Chapter 3. I am having a pretty bad time. I am not well, and I'm afraid to come to see you now, for fear something melodramatic might happen. Robert Oppenheimer, January 23rd, 1926. I was about to undergo a series of nearly disastrous existential crises that would begin that autumn and stretch into the spring of 1926. In mid-September 1925, he boarded a ship bound for England. He and Frances Ferguson had agreed that they would meet in the little village of Swanage in Dorsetshire in southwest England. Ferguson had spent the entire summer traveling about Europe with his mother and was now eager for some male companionship. For 10 days, they walked along the coastal cliffs, confiding to each other their latest adventures. Though they had not seen each other for 2 years, they had kept in touch through correspondence and remained close. When I met him at the station, Ferguson wrote afterwards, he seemed more self-confident, strong, and upstanding. He was far less embarrassed with Mother. This, I afterwards found out, was because he had nearly managed to fall in love with an attractive Gentile in New Mexico. Still, at the age of 21, Robert, Ferguson sensed, was completely at a loss about his sex life. For his part, Ferguson unfolded to him all the things that had pleased me and that I had to keep quiet about. In retrospect, however, Ferguson thought he had unburdened himself too much. I was cruel and stupid enough, he wrote, to go over with Robert these things at length, finally completing what Jean, a friend, would have called a first-class mental rape. By then, Ferguson had spent 2 full years as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. Frances had always been more mature than Robert, who now found himself dazzled by his friend's ease and social polish. To begin with, Frances had had a girlfriend for some 3 years, a young woman Robert had known from the ethical culture school named Frances Keeley. He was also impressed that Ferguson had demonstrated the self-confidence to abandon his major in biology for his first passion, literature and poetry. He was moving in elite social circles, visiting upper-class English families in their country houses. Robert found himself envious of his friend's blossoming sophistication, physics, or quantum mechanics. Briefly stated, quantum physics is the study of the laws that apply to the behavior of phenomena on a very small scale, the scale of molecules and atoms. Quantum theory was soon to replace classical physics when dealing with subatomic phenomena, such as an electron orbiting around the nucleus of a hydrogen atom. But if this was a hot time for physicists in Europe, Oppenheimer and many more senior American physicists were oblivious. I was still, in the bad sense of the word, a student, recalled Oppenheimer. I didn't learn about quantum mechanics until I got to Europe. I didn't learn about electron spin until I got to Europe. I don't believe that they were actually known in 25 in the spring in America. Anyway, I didn't know them. Robert settled into a depressing apartment that he later called a miserable hole. He took all his meals at the college and spent his days in a corner of J.J. Thomson's basement laboratory, trying to make thin beryllium films for use in the study of electrons. It was a laborious process which required the evaporation of beryllium onto collodion. Afterwards, the collodion had to be painstakingly discarded. Clumsy and inept at this meticulous work, Robert soon found himself avoiding the laboratory. Instead, he spent his time attending seminars and reading physics journals. But if his lab work was quite a sham, it nevertheless provided the occasion for him to meet physicists like Rutherford, Chadwick, and C.F. Powell. I met Patrick M.S. Blackett, whom I liked very much, Oppenheimer recalled decades later. Patrick Blackett, who would win the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1948, soon became one of Robert's tutors. A tall, elegant Englishman with forthright socialist politics, Blackett had completed his physics degree at Cambridge just 3 years earlier. In November 1925, Robert wrote Ferguson that the place is very rich and has plenty of luscious treasures. And although I am altogether unable to take advantage of them, yet I have a chance to see many people, and a few good ones. I am having a pretty bad time. The lab work is a terrible bore, and I am so bad at it that it is impossible to feel that I am learning anything. The lectures are vile. His difficulties in the laboratory were compounded by his deteriorating emotional state. One day, Robert caught himself staring at an empty blackboard with a piece of chalk in his hand, muttering over and over, "The point is, the point is, the point is." His Harvard friend, Jeffries Wyman, who was also at Cambridge that year, detected signs of distress. Walking into his room one day, Wyman found Robert lying on the floor, groaning and rolling from side to side. In another account of this incident, Wyman reported Oppenheimer as telling him that he felt so miserable in Cambridge, so unhappy, that he used sometimes to get down on the floor and roll from side to side. He told me that. On another occasion, Rutherford witnessed Oppenheimer collapsing in a heap on the floor of the laboratory. Neither was it any comfort that some of his closest friends were headed toward early domesticity. His Harvard roommate, Fred Bernheim, was also in Cambridge and had met a woman who would soon become his wife. Robert could see that his friendship with Bernheim was, predictably, petering out. "There are some terrible complications with Fred," Oppenheimer explained to Ferguson. "And an awful evening, 2 weeks ago, in the moon. I have not seen him since, and blush when I think of him. And a Dostoevskian confession from him." Robert demanded much of his friends, and sometimes his demands were just too much. In a way, Bernheim recalled, it was a relief. His intensity and his drive always made me feel slightly uncomfortable. His intensity and his drive always made me feel slightly uncomfortable. Bernheim felt drained in Robert's presence. Robert stubbornly tried to revive the friendship, but Bernheim finally told him that he was going to marry and that we couldn't reestablish what we'd had at Harvard. Robert was not so much offended as perplexed that someone he had known so well could decide to spin out of his orbit. His parents also had some inkling that their son was in crisis. According to Ferguson, Robert's depression was further increased and made specific by the struggle he was carrying on with his mother. Ella and Julius now insisted on rushing across the Atlantic to be with their troubled son. He wanted her, Ferguson wrote in his diary, but felt he ought to discourage her coming. so that when he got on the train for Southampton, where he was to meet her, he was exploding with every kind of wild revolution. Ferguson was a witness to only some of the extraordinary events that followed that winter. But clearly, many of the details that Ferguson recorded could only have come from Robert. And it is quite possible, indeed, it is almost certain, that in recounting his experiences, Robert allowed his vivid imagination to color his stories. Ferguson's account of the adventures of Robert Oppenheimer in Europe is dated simply February 26th, and the context suggests that it was written contemporaneously in February 1926. In any case, Ferguson did not reveal his friend's confidences until many years after Robert's death. According to Ferguson's account, an episode occurred aboard the train that indicated that Robert was losing control emotionally. He found himself in a third-class carriage with a man and woman who were making love, kissing, and perhaps fondling each other, we assume. And though he tried to read thermodynamics, he could not concentrate. When the man left, he, Robert, kissed the woman. She did not seem unduly surprised. Fortunately, he missed. Assuming that Ferguson accurately reported the story he was told, it seems clear that Robert was caught up in a fantasy. He wanted to kiss the woman. He did kiss her. He didn't. What happened exactly in that train compartment is uncertain. But what is reported to have occurred exiting the station surely did not happen, although Robert needed to tell Ferguson that it did. He was in trouble. He was losing control, and his fantastic tale was an expression of his distress. In this agitated state, Robert proceeded on to the port, where he was scheduled to greet his parents. The first person he saw on the gangplank was not his mother or father, but Inez Polak, a classmate from the Ethical Culture School. Robert had corresponded with Inez while she attended Vassar, and he had seen her on occasion in New York during vacations. In an interview decades later, Ferguson said he thought that Ella saw to it that there came with them to England a young woman that he, Robert, had seen in New York, and she tried to put them together, and it didn't work. In his diary, Ferguson writes that upon seeing Inez on the gangplank, Robert's first impulse had been to turn and run. Now, it would have been difficult, Ferguson wrote, to say who was the more terrified, Inez or Robert. For her part, Inez apparently saw in Robert an escape from her life in New York, where her mother had grown intolerable to her. Ella had agreed to escort her to England, thinking that Inez might help to distract Robert from his depression. But at the same time, according to Ferguson, Ella regarded Inez as ridiculously unworthy of her son. And as soon as she saw that Robert was actually showing an interest in the girl, she took Robert aside and spoke of how tiresome it was for Inez to have come over. Inez nevertheless accompanied the Oppenheimers to Cambridge. Robert busied himself with his physics, but in the afternoons, he began taking Inez on long walks about town. According to Ferguson, Robert went through the motions of courting her. After a time, there was a knock at the door, and they heard Mrs. Oppenheimer's voice saying, "Let me in, Inez. Why won't you let me in? I know Robert is in there." Ella finally stomped off in a huff, and Robert emerged, miserable and thoroughly humiliated. Polak left almost immediately for Italy, taking with her a copy of Dostoevsky's The Possessed as a gift from Robert. Naturally, the collapse of this relationship only deepened Robert's melancholy. Just before classes broke for Christmas, he wrote Herbert Smith a sad, wistful letter. Apologizing for his silence, he explained that, really, I have been engaged in the far more difficult business of making myself for a career. And I have not written, simply because I have lacked the comfortable conviction and assurance which are necessary to an adequately splendid letter. Referring to Francis, he wrote, he has changed a great deal. Exempli gratia, he is happy. He knows everyone at Oxford. He goes to tea with Lady Adeline Morell, the high priestess of civilized society, and the patroness of T.S. Eliot, and Bertie, Bertrand Russell. To the concern of his friends and family, Robert's emotional state continued to deteriorate. He seemed oddly unsure of himself and stubbornly morose. Among other complaints, he talked about his troubled relationship with his head tutor, Patrick Blackett. Robert liked Blackett and eagerly sought his approval, but Blackett, being a hands-on, experimental physicist, hounded Robert to do more of what he wasn't good at: laboratory work. Blackett probably thought nothing of it, but in Oppenheimer's agitated state, the relationship became a source of intense anxiety. Late that autumn of 1925, Robert did something so stupid that it seemed calculated to prove that his emotional distress was overwhelming him. Consumed by feelings of inadequacy and intense jealousy, he poisoned an apple with chemicals from the laboratory and left it on Blackett's desk. Jeffries Wyman later said, "Whether or not this was an imaginary apple or a real apple, whatever it was an act of jealousy." Of course, there was hell to pay with Cambridge. If the alleged poison was potentially lethal, what Robert had done amounted to attempted murder. But this seems improbable, given what happened next. More likely, Robert had laced the apple with something that merely would have made Blackett sick. But this was still a serious matter, and grounds for expulsion. As Robert's parents were still visiting Cambridge, the university authorities immediately informed them of what had happened. Julius Oppenheimer frantically and successfully lobbied the university not to press criminal charges. After protracted negotiations, it was agreed that Robert would be put on probation and have regular sessions with a prominent Harley Street psychiatrist in London. As Robert's old ethical culture school mentor, Herbert Smith, put it, he was retained at Cambridge for a while, only on condition that he had periodic interviews with a psychiatrist. Robert traveled to London for regularly scheduled sessions, but it was not a good experience. A Freudian psychoanalyst diagnosed dementia praecox, a now archaic label for symptoms associated with schizophrenia. He concluded that Oppenheimer was a hopeless case and that further analysis would do more harm than good. Ferguson went to meet Oppenheimer one day just after. Robert had finished a session with the psychiatrist. He looked crazy at that time. I saw him standing on the corner, waiting for me, with his hat on one side of his head, looking absolutely weird. He was sort of standing around, looking like he might run or do something drastic. The two old friends took off together at a more than brisk pace, Robert walking his peculiar walk with his feet turned out at a severe angle. I asked him how it had been. He said that the guy was too stupid to follow him, and that he knew more about his troubles than the doctor did, which was probably true. At the time, Ferguson was still unaware of the poisoned apple incident, so he did not understand what had precipitated the psychiatric visits. It was a rainy, dreary winter day, and years later, Oppenheimer said he had a vivid realization. I was on the point of bumping myself off. This was chronic. Sometime shortly after New Year's 1926, Ferguson arranged to meet Oppenheimer in Paris, where Robert's parents had taken him for the remainder of the 6-week-long winter break. On one of their long walks through the streets of Paris, Robert finally confided in his friend, explaining what had precipitated his visits to the London psychiatrist. At this point, Robert thought the Cambridge authorities might not even let him return. My reaction was dismay, Ferguson recalled. But then, when he talked about it, I thought he had sort of gone beyond it, and that he was having trouble with his father. Robert acknowledged that his parents were very worried, that they were trying to help him, but that they were not succeeding. Robert was getting very little sleep, and, according to Ferguson, he began to get very queer. One morning, he locked his mother in her hotel room and left. Ella was furious. After this incident, Ella insisted that he see a French psychoanalyst. After several sessions, this doctor announced that Robert was suffering a crise morale associated with sexual frustration. He prescribed une femme and a course of aphrodisiacs. Years later, Ferguson observed of that time. He, Robert, was completely at a loss about his sex life. Soon, Robert's emotional crisis took another violent turn. Sitting in his Paris hotel room with Robert, Ferguson sensed that his friend was in one of his ambiguous moods. Perhaps in an attempt to divert him from his depression, Ferguson showed him some poetry written by his girlfriend, Frances Keeley, and then announced that he had proposed to Keeley and she had accepted. Robert was stunned at this news, and he snapped. I leaned over to pick up a book, Ferguson recalled, and he jumped on me from behind with a trunk strap and wound it around my neck. I was quite scared for a little while. We must have made some noise. Robert kept darting theatrically at her, Frances Keeley. How easy it was for him to act the violent lover. How I know the feeling from experience. Despite the choking incident, Ferguson stood by his friend. Indeed, he may even have felt some guilt, since he had been forewarned in a letter by none other than Herbert Smith, who knew Robert's vulnerabilities all too well. I've a notion, by the way, that your ability to show him, Robert, about should be exercised with great tact, rather than in royal profusion. Your 2 years' start and social adaptivity are likely to make him despair. And instead of flying at your throat, as I remember you're being ready to do for George, what's his name? When you were similarly awed by him, italics added, I'm afraid he'd merely cease to think his own life worth living. Smith's letter raises the question of whether Ferguson, an aspiring writer, may have conflated his own experience with George and Oppenheimer's behavior. But Robert would apologize in a manner that makes Ferguson's story credible. Ferguson understood that his friend had a neurotic streak, but he also thought he could see Robert growing out of it. He knew that I knew that this was a momentary spasm. I think that I would have been more worried if I hadn't realized how rapidly he was changing. I liked him very much. The two men would remain lifelong friends. All the same, for some months after the assault, Ferguson felt it prudent to be on his guard. He moved out of the hotel, and he hesitated when Robert insisted that he visit him in Cambridge that spring. Robert was no doubt as perplexed by his own behavior as was Francis. He wrote his friend a few weeks after the incident that you should have, not a letter, but a pilgrimage to Oxford, made in a hair shirt, with much fasting and snow and prayer. But I will keep my remorse and gratitude, and the shame I feel for my inadequacy to you until I can do something rather less useless for you. I do not understand your forbearance, nor your charity, but you must know that I will not forget them. There are 2 copper wires together, which is probably succeeding in getting me crazy. He then confessed, I am not well, and I'm afraid to come to see you now, for fear something melodramatic might happen. Setting aside his qualms, Ferguson eventually agreed to visit Cambridge early that spring. He put me in a room next door, and I remember thinking that I'd better make sure that he didn't turn up in the night. So I put a chair up against the door, but nothing happened. By then, Robert seemed to be on the mend. When Ferguson briefly raised the matter, he said that he needn't worry, that he was over that. Indeed, Robert had been seeing yet another psychoanalyst, his third within 4 months, in Cambridge. By this time, Robert had read a good deal about psychoanalysis, and according to his friend John Edsall, he took it very seriously. He also thought that his new analyst, a Dr. M, was a wiser and more sensible man than either of the doctors he had consulted in London and Paris. Robert apparently continued to see this analyst throughout the spring of 1926. But over time, their relationship broke down. One day in June, Robert dropped by John Edsall's lodgings and told him that Dr. M has decided that there's no use in going on with the analysis any further. Herbert Smith later ran into one of his psychiatrist friends in New York who knew of the case and claimed that Robert gave the psychiatrist in Cambridge an outrageous song and dance. The trouble is, you've got to have a psychiatrist who is abler than the person who's being analyzed. They don't have anybody. In mid-March 1926, Robert left Cambridge on a short vacation. 3 friends, Jeffries Wyman, Frederick Bernheim, and John Edsall, had talked him into accompanying them to Corsica. For 10 days, they bicycled the length of the island, sleeping in small village inns or camping out in the open. The island's craggy mountains and lightly forested high mesas may well have reminded Robert of New Mexico's rugged beauty. The scenery was magnificent, recalled Bernheim. Verbal communication with the natives disastrous, and the local fleas abundantly fed each night in a nearby inn. As they hung their wet clothes by a fire and huddled in blankets, Edsall insisted, Tolstoy is the writer I most enjoy. No, Dostoevsky is superior, Oppenheimer said. He gets to the soul and torment of man. Later, when the conversation turned to their respective futures, Robert remarked, the kind of person that I admire most would be one who becomes extraordinarily good at doing a lot of things, but still maintains a tear-stained countenance. If Robert seemed burdened by such intensely existential thoughts, his companions nevertheless got a strong impression that he was unburdening himself as they hiked around the island. Clearly relishing the dramatic scenery, the good French food and wines, he wrote his brother Frank, it's a great place, with every virtue from wine to glaciers, and from langoust to brigantines. In Corsica, Wyman believed, Robert was passing through a great emotional crisis. And then, something strange happened. One day, Wyman recalled decades later, when we'd almost finished our time in Corsica, we were staying in some little inn, the 3 of us, Edsall, Oppenheimer, and I, and we were having dinner together. The waiter approached Oppenheimer and told him when the next boat departed for France. Surprised, Edsall and Wyman asked Oppenheimer why he was rushing back earlier than planned. "I can't bear to speak of it," Robert replied, "but I've got to go." Later in the evening, after they had drunk a little more wine, he relented and said, "Well, perhaps I can tell you why I have to go. I've done a terrible thing. I've put a poisoned apple on Blackett's desk, and I've got to go back and see what happened." Edsel and Wyman were stunned. "I never knew," Wyman recalled, "whether it was real or imaginary." Robert didn't elaborate, but he did mention that he had been diagnosed with dementia praecox. Unaware that the poisoned apple incident had actually occurred the previous autumn, Wyman and Edsel assumed that Robert, in a fit of jealousy, had done something to Blackett that spring, just before their trip to Corsica. Ferguson made it quite plain that the incident occurred in the late autumn of 1925, and not in the spring of 1926. All this happened during his Robert's first term at Cambridge, and just before I met him in London, when he was going to the psychiatrist. When Sherwin asked if he really believed the poisoned apple story, Ferguson replied, "Yes, I do. I do." His father then had to engineer the authorities of Cambridge about Robert's attempted murder. Talking with Alice Kimball Smith in 1976, Ferguson referred to the time when he, Robert, tried to poison one of his people. He told me about it at the time, or shortly thereafter in Paris. I always assumed that it was probably true, but I don't know. He was doing all sorts of crazy things then. Ferguson certainly appeared to Smith to be a reliable source. As she noted after interviewing him, he doesn't pretend to remember anything he doesn't. Oppenheimer's prolonged adolescence was finally coming to an end. Sometime during his short stay in Corsica, something happened to him in the nature of an awakening. Whatever it was, Oppenheimer made sure that it remained a carefully cultivated mystery. Perhaps it was a fleeting love affair, but more likely not. Years later, he would respond to a query from the author Newell Farr Davis. The psychiatrist was a prelude to what began for me in Corsica. You ask whether I will tell you the full story, or whether you must dig it out. But it is known to few, and they won't tell. You can't dig it out. What you need to know is that it was not a mere love affair. Not a love affair at all, but love. The encounter held some kind of mystical, transcendental meaning for Oppenheimer. Geography was henceforth the only separation I recognized, but for me, it was not a real separation. It was, he told Davis, a great thing in my life, a great and lasting part of it, more to me now, even more as I look back when my life is nearly over. So, what actually happened in Corsica? Probably nothing. Oppenheimer deliberately answered Davis's query about Corsica with an enigma sure to frustrate his biographers. Troubled soul. Reading it in the evening by flashlight during his walking tour of Corsica, he later claimed to his Berkeley friend, Håkon Chevalier, was one of the great experiences of his life. It snapped him out of his depression. Proust's work is a classic novel of introspection, and it left a deep and lasting impression on Oppenheimer. More than a decade after he first read Proust, Oppenheimer startled Chevalier by quoting from memory a passage in Volume 1 that discusses cruelty. Perhaps she would not have considered evil to be so rare, so extraordinary, so estranging a state, to which it was so restful to emigrate, had she been able to discern in herself, as in everyone, that indifference to the sufferings one causes, an indifference which, whatever other names one may give it, is the terrible and permanent form of cruelty. As a young man in Corsica, Robert no doubt memorized these words precisely because he saw in himself an indifference to the sufferings he caused others. It was a painful insight. One can only speculate about a man's inner life, but perhaps seeing an expression of his own dark and guilt-laden thoughts in print somehow lightened Robert's psychological burden. It had to be comforting to know that he was not alone, that this was part of the human condition. He no longer need despise himself. He could love. And perhaps it was also reassuring, particularly for an intellectual, that Robert could tell himself that it was a book and not a psychiatrist, which had helped to wrench him from the black hole of his depression. Oppenheimer returned to Cambridge with a lighter, more forgiving attitude about life. I felt much kinder and more tolerant, he recalled. I could now relate to others. By June 1926, he decided to end his sessions with the Cambridge psychiatrist. It also lifted his spirits that spring to leave the miserable hole he had till then occupied in Cambridge and move into less miserable quarters along the River Cam, halfway to Grantchester, a quaint village 1 mile south of Cambridge, University of Copenhagen, in 1911. 2 years later, he achieved the key theoretical breakthrough in early quantum mechanics by postulating quantum jumps in the orbital momentum of an electron around the nucleus of an atom. In 1922, he won the Nobel Prize for this theoretical model of atomic structure. Tall and athletic, a warm and gentle soul with a wry sense of humor, Bohr was universally admired. He always spoke in a self-effacing near whisper. Not often in life, Albert Einstein wrote to Bohr in the spring of 1920, has a human being caused me such joy by his mere presence as you did. Einstein was charmed by Bohr's manner of uttering his opinions like one perpetually groping, and never like one who believed himself to be in the possession of definite truth. Oppenheimer came to speak of Bohr as his God. At that point, I forgot about beryllium and films and decided to try to learn the trade of being a theoretical physicist. By that time, I was fully aware that it was an unusual time, that great things were afoot. That spring, with his mental health on the mend, Oppenheimer worked steadily on what would become his first major paper in theoretical physics, a study of the collision or continuous spectrum problem. It was hard work. One day, he walked into Ernest Rutherford's office and saw Bohr sitting in a chair. Rutherford rose from behind his desk and introduced his student to Bohr. The renowned Danish physicist then asked politely, "How is it going?" Robert replied bluntly, "I'm in difficulties." Bohr asked, "Are the difficulties mathematical or physical?" When Robert replied, "I don't know," Bohr said, "That's bad." Bohr vividly remembered the encounter. Oppenheimer had looked uncommonly youthful, and after he left the room, Rutherford had turned to Bohr and remarked that he had high expectations for the young man. Years later, Robert reflected that Bohr's question, "Are the problems mathematical or physical?" was a very good one. I thought it put a rather useful glare on the extent to which I became embroiled in formal questions, without stepping back to see what they really had to do with the physics of the problem. He realized that a physicist like Bohr regarded mathematics as Dirac regards words, namely, as a way to make himself intelligible to other people. So there's a very wide spectrum. At Cambridge, I was simply learning and hadn't learned very much. By temperament and talent, Robert was very much a verbal physicist in the style of Bohr. late that spring, Cambridge organized a week-long visit to the University of Leiden for American physics students. Oppenheimer went on the trip and met several German physicists. It was wonderful, he recalled, and I realized then that some of the troubles of the winter had been exacerbated by the English customs. Upon his return to Cambridge, he met another German physicist, Max Born, director of the Institute of Theoretical Physics at the University of Göttingen. Born was intrigued by Oppenheimer, partly because the 22-year-old American was grappling with some of the same theoretical problems raised in the recent papers by Heisenberg and Schrödinger. Oppenheimer seemed to me, Born said, right from the beginning, a very gifted man. By the end of that spring, Oppenheimer had accepted an invitation from Born to study at Göttingen. Cambridge had been a disastrous year for Robert. He had narrowly escaped expulsion over the poison apple incident. For the first time in his life, he had found himself incapable of excelling intellectually, and his closest friends had witnessed more than one episode of emotional instability. But he had overcome a winter of depression and was now ready to explore an entirely new field of intellectual endeavor. When I got to Cambridge, Robert said, I was faced with the problem of looking at a question to which no one knew the answer, but I wasn't willing to face it. When I left Cambridge, I didn't know how to face it very well, but I understood that this was my job. This was the change that occurred that year. Robert later recalled that he still had very great misgivings about myself on all fronts, but I clearly was going to do theoretical physics if I could. I felt completely relieved of the responsibility to go back into a laboratory. I hadn't been good. I hadn't done anybody any good, and I hadn't had any fun whatever. And here was something I felt just driven to try.
As we bring Chapter 3 of American Prometheus to a close, we find ourselves further immersed in the extraordinary journey of our American hero. This chapter has unveiled even more layers of their life, bringing us closer to the heart of their story. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where the narrative continues to evolve and we uncover further aspects of their legacy and impact on American history. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when the next chapter unfolds. Until then, keep the pages turning, and we'll see you in the next episode as we continue to explore American Prometheus.